March 1945, somewhere outside Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The wind sliced through the snowy plains with a whistle sharp enough to cut flesh. The railcars had long since hissed to a halt, and the guards weren't shouting anymore. They were just waiting, arms crossed, watching from beneath the brims of their wide Army-issue hats. The last German women climbed down the steel steps of the train, clutching coats that barely fought the cold. The dry, high-country air stung their lungs. Then one of them snorted, loudly. "Herrgott, look at that one," Marta Weiss said, her gloved finger pointing bluntly toward a distant figure hauling crates. "Is he a soldier or a sausage?" The others burst into laughter, some half-hearted, some sharp, but the tension broke, and for a moment even the frost couldn't stifle the strange warmth of ridicule. From their narrow vantage behind the chain-link fence of barbed wire being hastily unrolled, the American soldiers didn't look like the fabled conquerors of Europe. They looked padded, overfed. Their jackets bulged in odd places. Their cheeks weren't gaunt with deprivation or hardened by ruin. They looked clean, well-fed, almost sleepy. "They win the war with food," sneered Helga. "Not guns, just drown us in pies and bacon." Marta smirked. "Too fat to fight, look at them, not even ashamed." They were bitter, yes, but there was something else behind their jeering, confusion. Back in the Reich, the posters had shown America as a crude and chaotic nation. Brutal jazz, gangsters with Tommy guns, women smoking like men. But not this. Not these quiet, organized men unloading box after box of canned meat, flour, and tools without shouting, without slapping one another, without fear in their eyes. Just calm efficiency and some inexplicable confidence that made the German women squint. That squint deepened when they were marched, escorted, really into the camp proper. There were no concrete walls, no screaming, no snarling dogs. Instead, there were pine cabins lined up like something out of a children's book, each with chimneys exhaling warm smoke. A central mess hall, a medical hut, even a schoolhouse. Several of the women blinked. A few shook their heads as if to dismiss the illusion. This wasn't a prison, it looked like a summer retreat for Red Cross nurses. And then came the first true shock. Inside the cabin, each bed had a woolen blanket folded perfectly at the foot. A toothbrush, a bar of soap, a comb, a mirror. Someone had placed a flower in a tin can by the window, real, fresh. "The men's camps had lice and straw," muttered Gertrude. "Why is this?" But her voice trailed off. A few of the women had already discovered something else, something they couldn't quite believe. A bulletin board near the mess entrance listed the weekly schedule. Baking, English lessons, optional sewing classes, library hours, and scrawled in wide, bold chalk letters, U.S. Army PT demo Thursday morning, spectators ALLOWED. "What SPT?" asked Ng, furrowing her brow. "Physical training," Marta replied flatly, her eyes narrowing. "They're going to show off." "Och," said Helga, sneering. "Let the fat ones dance." Laughter again. But by Thursday, no one was laughing. They gathered behind a rope line outside the parade ground, coats cinched tight against the bitter wind. A few of the guards stood nearby, offering no explanation. One of them, the taller one with the polite smile and unreadable eyes, just nodded at them as if to say, "Wait." And then, at precisely 700, it began. The silence shattered with a single barked order. 20 American soldiers, stripped down to undershirts and canvas trousers, stepped forward in formation. Their boots hit the frost-hardened dirt in synchronized thunder. One step, two, three, then a pause, and then they exploded into movement. Push-ups, dozens clean and sharp, chests slamming to the ground and rising again. Then jumping jacks, pull-ups from steel bars hoisted between poles, sit-ups in rows like machines. They moved with a rhythm that was brutal, precise. Their breath turned to steam. Their skin gleamed in the cold. One of them, easily over 200 pounds, took off in a sprint and began climbing a rope that had been soaked in last night's sleet. He didn't stop until he rang the bell at the top, 20 feet up. The German women didn't speak. They didn't blink. Another soldier, this one barely older than 20, carried 2 sandbags across the field, then began flipping a heavy tractor tire end over end. The sounds were dull, thudding, relentless. A whistle blew, obstacle course. They ran it fast, vaulting wooden walls, crawling under barbed wire, dragging dummies across the field. One missed his landing and rolled, but got up instantly, bleeding from the elbow, and kept going. After 20 minutes their clothes were soaked, their faces flushed, but not one had dropped. Not one had stopped. And every time they finished a round they lined up again, perfectly still, chests heaving, eyes locked ahead. It was Marta who finally muttered it, voice flat. "They're not fat." Helga didn't reply. Her lips were parted slightly, not in awe but not far from it either. A sudden burst of noise cracked through the air. Not gunfire. Laughter. The American soldiers were done. The bell had been rung, but instead of collapsing they were grinning, elbowing each other, grabbing canteens, patting backs. Their faces were soaked with sweat but not grim. This wasn't punishment. This was routine. The tall American guard turned slightly toward the POWs, his expression unreadable. "They do this every morning," he said, "twice a day on Mondays and Fridays." He let that sit, then walked away. For the first time since arriving in American custody, the German women were silent, not out of defiance, but because something inside had shifted. They had mocked the food. They had mocked the uniforms. They had mocked the soft-faced boys with the kind eyes and the big boots. But now they didn't quite know what to mock. And it was only the beginning. Marta lay awake that night in her bunk. The flower by her window still glowed faintly in the moonlight. Her hands were clean. Her belly was full. She couldn't stop hearing the thud of boots, the clang of rope, the bell ringing high above the training yard. She had seen men collapse in Russian mud, seen others freeze in trenches with brittle rifles and no gloves. But these Americans, they trained like men who hadn't known hunger, who weren't afraid of work, and who didn't need to shout to be dangerous. That, she thought, was worse than arrogance. It was power, quiet, terrifying power. And it wasn't over. The next morning came heavy with silence. Not the kind of silence that blankets a camp when nothing is happening, but the kind that meant thoughts were simmering. The kind that meant yesterday hadn't been processed, not really. Something about what they had seen had tugged at the foundations of their certainty, and for prisoners, certainty was the last fortress. Marta hadn't spoken since roll call. She barely touched her oatmeal, though she still pocketed the sugar packet. Habits were hard to kill, so was pride. Gertrude leaned in across the table. "They're not like we were told," she whispered, eyeing the guards pacing outside the mess hall windows. "They don't scream, they don't strike, they don't even look at us with hate." Marta didn't respond. Instead, she looked at the walls of the mess hall. They were wood, yes, but well-maintained. There were framed notices, a clock that ticked precisely. A faint radio played something strange and mournful, blues music maybe, though none of the women had the vocabulary for it. It didn't belong in a prison. But then again, nothing here did. The physical training display had left its mark in the most unexpected way. It removed the caricature. No longer could the German women lean on the belief that Americans were soft, stupid giants. They had watched those giants move with terrifying grace and strength. It wasn't bravado. It was just routine. They were strong because that's how they lived, not because they wanted to show off. And that unsettled Marta more than anything. She remembered the men back in Munich, officers who barked orders but hadn't touched a shovel in years. Men who posed for photos with medals but trembled if their boots got wet. But these American boys, they climbed ropes with bloodied hands and laughed about it afterward. The illusion had cracked. By noon, that crack began to widen. A list had been posted near the main cabin, typed, not handwritten, and with surprising formality. Labor detail volunteer roster. Voluntary. Not assigned. That was the first surprise. The second was what it entailed. The guards explained in clipped, polite English. The war was still on, but here, under the Geneva Convention, POWs could volunteer for non-military labor. No force. No punishment if they declined. But if they accepted cleaning stables, loading hay, folding laundry, even helping prep food, they'd be paid. Actual wages. Pocket money. Usable at the small commissary near the guard shack. Marta narrowed her eyes at the word. Commissary. Like a store, she asked. The guard nodded. Toothpaste, paper, sometimes small sweets, whatever makes it this far inland. She signed up. So did 6 others. Not because they wanted American toothpaste, but because they wanted to see more. The labor detail began the next day. Marta was sent to assist in the laundry hut. The air inside was hot and wet, almost tropical. A woman named Miss Caroline ran the place, short, wiry, and completely unimpressed by anyone's rank or attitude. She greeted Marta with a nod, handed her a basket, and pointed to the far washing bin. Start there, whites go first. Marta blinked. I don't. You'll learn. That was it. No shouting, no lectures. Just work. And Marta, to her own surprise, liked it. The heat soaked into her bones. Her hands felt useful again. The radio played something lively now, swing, they called it, strange rhythms, drums that didn't march but danced. And Miss Caroline, humming as she scrubbed collars, moved like she'd been born to that music. At first, Marta tried to hold herself apart. She was a prisoner after all, a German, a foreigner. But on the third day, Caroline handed her a wrapped piece of hard candy without a word. And Marta accepted it. And for the first time, something like shame pricked at her spine. That afternoon, as she walked back from the laundry hut, Marta passed the training yard again. It was empty now, just rows of logs and ropes and pull-up bars, but it had changed in her mind. Not a performance arena, not a theater. A forge. She hadn't realized how much that mattered until later that week. Because Friday came, and the bell rang again. Double PT. And this time, it wasn't just the Americans who showed up. Some of the male prisoners, men held in the camp further east, had been invited to observe. And they came. Marta watched from behind the mess hall, her hands still damp from scrubbing. She recognized one of the men, Heinrich, a former Wehrmacht infantryman who had once sneered about American decadence while hoarding powdered milk packets under his bunk. Now he stood silent, arms folded, face unreadable. The Americans began their second round. This time they added weight vests, carried logs as a team, dragged heavy sleds through the slush. It wasn't just individual strength now, it was coordination, rhythm. Something about it felt military, but not the way the Reich understood it. This wasn't drilled obedience. It was something more dangerous. Discipline. Earned internal, not imposed by fear. Afterward, as they dispersed, Heinrich muttered aloud, perhaps forgetting the women could hear. No one made them do this. He sounded tired. Marta turned to look at him. That frightens you. He paused. Yes. That night the commissary opened for an hour. Marta still had her first week's earnings, 35 cents in camp script, enough for a comb and a small bar of chocolate. Behind the counter, a young American soldier manned the till. He looked barely older than 17, fresh-faced. He handed her the chocolate without looking up, but then said, almost quietly, My uncle was in Bastogne. Marta blinked. She had not expected conversation. He says the snow was like powdered glass, couldn't feel his fingers for days. She didn't know what to say. Her fingers still ached from Munich's winter blackouts. He saw Germans burn trucks, the boy continued, voice neutral, but also said your guys gave good fight. Marta stared at him. Then finally, my brother froze near Smolensk. He nodded. Neither smiled, neither cursed, just two sides of a world too wide to explain in words. But as she stepped outside, snow beginning to fall again, Marta realized something strange had happened. She no longer hated them. And that frightened her. The days turned. Laundry, meals, roll calls. And every morning the Americans trained. Without fail. Even when it snowed. Even when it rained. Even on Sundays. By the second week, Marta stopped watching out of curiosity and started watching because she couldn't stop. They weren't glamorous, they weren't perfect. Sometimes one would stumble, sometimes they'd argue, but they never quit. And that rhythm, the thud of boots, the slap of rope, the clang of metal, became the heartbeat of the camp. One afternoon, Gertrude returned from the woodshop with a sliver in her palm and a dazed look on her face. "You know," she said softly, "they have women here in uniform." Marta turned. Women, American, uniforms, not nurses, soldiers. She let that hang. Marta narrowed her eyes. Doing what? Driving trucks, handling supplies, one of them oversees inventory. She held up a slip of paper. Her name, S. Sergeant Jensen. She outranks most of the men. Marta took a slow breath. The Reich had women, yes, for cooking, for typing, for bearing children. But never this. Never command. The fortress cracked a little more. Later that week, Miss Caroline handed Marta a stack of clean undershirts to fold. She noticed one was marked with a stencil. SLCRAWFORD SSGT 84THINF Div. She turned it in her hands. The fabric was thick, clean, but stained faintly at the edges, mud, sweat, oil. It had been worn hard and carefully washed. These weren't lazy men or pampered ones. They just prepared differently. The word pulsed through her brain like a distant drumbeat. Prepared. That, she realized, was the difference. Back home, everything had been for show. The banners, the medals, even the strength was theatrical. But here, the Americans trained not because of propaganda, not for inspection, but because they intended to be ready always. Too fat to fight? No. Too strong to care what anyone thought. And that was a lesson she couldn't unsee. By the third week, they no longer jeered. Not at the drills, not at the boots, not at the soldiers who laughed as they bench-pressed logs in sleet while music echoed from a field radio stuck between a mess tin and a coil of rope. What had once seemed absurd now settled like an unspoken truth. These Americans weren't posturing. They were rehearsing. For what, Marta didn't know. But she suspected it wasn't just war. It was something deeper, cultural, a kind of muscle memory not just in their limbs but in how they approached everything. Work, conversation, humiliation. They absorbed it, learned from it, and kept moving forward, without theatrics. It wasn't the lack of cruelty that disturbed her. It was the lack of fear. And she wasn't alone in that feeling anymore. The POW camp had grown quiet in ways even the guards noticed. Gone were the snide comments about American softness. The sarcastic impersonations of GIs lumbering through the snow had stopped. Even Helga, who once counted how many double chins each American had, now walked silently to mess with her eyes straight ahead. Something had shifted. It was during a February snow squall, one of the last, they hoped, that the change became visible. The storm had blown in overnight. By morning, drifts piled against the mess hall windows. The guards shoveled walkways without complaint, their breath ghosting in the air. Then, as if summoned, the bell rang again. PT. Marta rolled her eyes without meaning to, not in mockery but disbelief. They were really going to train in this. Yes, they were. She watched through the fogged mess hall window as 20 men lined up. This time no shirts, just undershirts and gloves. Their boots sank deep into the snow, but they didn't flinch. The sergeant blew his whistle, and they dropped straight into push-ups, steam rising from their backs like war horses at rest. They moved slower, but they moved. Marta glanced at Gertrude. You think they're trying to prove something? No, Gertrude said. They just don't believe in stopping. She was right. Because it wasn't just training anymore. Not for the Americans, not for the POWs watching. It had become a symbol, a message. You are here, we are here, but the war isn't over, and we are ready. That readiness bled into other areas. The guards weren't cruel, but they were sharp. Procedures ran on time. Meals were consistent but not luxurious. Everything was just so, like a machine still humming even when idle. One afternoon, Marta was assigned to help sort supplies. Inside the supply tent, she found something unexpected, a notebook. Leather-bound, American-made, she flipped it open. It was a log. PT Journal SGT, M. Collins. Inside, each day was marked with brutal precision. Monday, 600 HRS, wind 12 knots, 3-mile run, 60 push-ups, 60 sit-ups, sled drag. Tuesday, snow, 4 sets of obstacle course, rope climb, log carry, 25 pull-ups. Wednesday, rain rest, rifle maintenance, team drills, map reading. Thursday, 3-mile march with 40 lb pack, 60 sit-ups, fireman carry drills. On and on it went, pages, weeks, months. She turned to the back. There scrawled in pencil, "If we sweat more in peace, we bleed less in war." She stared at the line. That, she realized, was the truth, the quiet core. They weren't showing off. They were preparing to survive. And suddenly, she remembered her brother again. Hans, age 21, drafted straight from his university lecture hall into the Eastern Front. The first time he touched a rifle was in snow up to his waist. The first time he climbed anything was a ladder into a trench that collapsed beneath him. He died in Ukraine, not from gunfire, from exposure. No preparation. Just orders. Marta returned the notebook exactly where she found it, but it followed her all day. And that evening, something strange happened. A commotion near the yard. The POWs were brought out, not in panic but purpose. A civilian truck had arrived. Inside, crates of building supplies. A few of the prisoners who spoke better English were called forward. The Americans needed help rebuilding a section of the training course. Helga volunteered. So did Marta. So did 4 others. And for the first time, they stepped onto the training yard not as spectators, but as workers. The wood was rough. The nails were hard to drive. The Americans didn't offer praise, but they didn't insult either. They simply passed hammers, held boards, adjusted ropes. Work. Real work. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between the two groups. You are strong. So are we. They didn't have to say it. The sweat did the talking. By nightfall, the new pull-up station stood in the snow, clean lines, sturdy braces, ropes taut and ready. One American slapped the post twice, satisfied. Good work, he muttered to no one in particular. Helga didn't respond. She just stared at the station. Later in the mess, she said it quietly to Marta. I could do that, the pull-up, just once. Marta smirked. You'd fall and break your nose. Maybe, but I'd try. A pause. They don't wait for permission to be strong, do they? No, Marta said, they just are. By March, the camp had changed. Not visibly. The same pine cabins, the same uniforms, the same chow lines and mail calls and Sunday hymns from the chapel down the hill. But the women moved differently. Their posture straighter, their routines tighter. And without formal order, without any command, some of them began mimicking the PT drills in the mornings. Not officially, not in formation, but behind the cabins where guards pretended not to notice. A few stretches. A few push-ups. Just to see if they could. It wasn't about becoming American. It was about reclaiming something. Their strength. The war had taken their pride, their homes, their sense of control. But this little piece of discipline, they could own again. She held his gaze. No. He turned to the corporal at his side. Get them gloves and boots that won't shred on gravel. He turned back to Marta. You're not soldiers, you're not guests, but if you want to train, then train. We don't stop anyone from improving themselves here. And that was it. Permission without ceremony. The next morning the gloves arrived, worn leather mismatched but real, a few pairs of military boots, water canteens. No cheering, no introductions. Just sweat. That week, Marta pulled herself to the top of the rope for the first time. The American soldiers clapped. Not mockingly. Not indulgently. Genuine, hard-earned applause. One of them, Staff Sergeant Markovitz, approached after the drill. You ever carry someone across a battlefield? He asked. No, Marta said. Then try dragging Helga 20 feet across the mud. She blinked. You want me to? It's what we do. In case someone's hit, do it. Helga groaned. I am not light. Doesn't matter, Markovitz said. She could be your only way out. Marta nodded. Dropped into the mud. Grabbed Helga beneath the arms. And began to drag. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. But she did it. All 20 feet. When she let go, breath ragged, she looked up to see 2 American guards watching silently. Then nodding. Markovitz helped her up. You learn fast. Because I have to, Marta said. No, he replied, because you choose to. That afternoon, Helga asked if she could run laps behind the cabins. Marta said yes. April brought mail. For the first time since Christmas, letters filtered through the Red Cross, some crumpled and faint, others folded crisp and sent from cities that didn't exist anymore. Marta's came from Dresden. It was unsigned, just one sentence. I heard you survived. I hope you remain that way. She read it 3 times. Then tucked it in her boot. Training the next day, she carried a log on her shoulders for half a mile without dropping it. That night under her bunk, she wrote something of her own. Not to send. Just to say. Today I outran the woman I was before. I don't know who I'm becoming, but she doesn't ask for permission to be strong. She didn't show anyone. But she folded it neatly and kept it under her pillow. By mid-April, the Americans built a second training field. Unofficially. Just a few posts, a bar, a new tire. For the women. Still separated by the rope line but now acknowledged, built for them, no speeches, no flags. Just hardware. On the first day they used it, the American drill instructor paused his own formation and shouted across the yard. Any of you want to run with my men, you better do the full course. A dare, but also an invitation. Marta wiped sweat from her brow and stepped to the starting line. She didn't finish first. She didn't finish clean. But she finished. And that night, something even more unbelievable happened. She was invited to speak at Sunday assembly. Not formally. Not with a microphone. Just 10 minutes. A reflection. She stood at the front of the mess hall, surrounded by Americans and POWs alike, the ceiling lights buzzing above, and cleared her throat. "I once believed the strongest were those who yelled the loudest," she said. "Then I believed it was those who carried weapons. Then I believed it was those who survived." She paused. "But now I think the strongest are those who do hard things, even when they don't have to." She stepped back. Silence. Then a slow clap. Then the rest. In May, the war ended. For some. For others, it was just a word. Nothing changed in the camp that day. The bells still rang. The drills still ran. The prisoners still folded clothes and cleaned floors. There were no celebrations, just a quiet dinner. But that night, the guards didn't lock the cabin doors. Just closed them gently. Marta stared at the handle for a long time. Then let it be. In the morning, she ran 5 laps before the sun rose. No one asked her to. No one told her to. She just did. Because that's what strength looked like now. And somewhere between the 1st and 5th lap, the voice of the old Marta, the bitter, sharp-tongued girl who pointed at American soldiers and laughed, disappeared into the cold Nebraska wind. Replaced by someone leaner. Someone quieter. Someone strong. The war was over, but the fences stayed up. The U.S. Army didn't unlock the gates the moment the surrender was signed. Repatriation was a process, not an event. Trains had to be scheduled. Ships had to be assigned. And Europe, well, Europe wasn't exactly ready to receive its lost children. Not yet. So the women waited. And while they waited, they ran. Each morning at dawn, the bell rang, not by order, not by rule, but by habit. The guards didn't sound it anymore. Marta did. She rose in the blue haze of pre-sunlight, laced up her boots, and struck the old iron bell with the handle of a mop. The sound rang low, then high, carrying across the prairie like the call of some animal that refused extinction. And every morning, without fail, the others followed. At first it was a few. Then a dozen. By June, nearly every woman in the camp, over 70 of them, was doing some form of PT. Some ran, some marched, some stretched behind the cabins in rows. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't military. But it was something better. It was voluntary. Inji led the warm-ups now. She had no real authority, but the others followed her all the same. Gertrude ran the tire circuit. Helga timed the laps with a rusted watch borrowed from a medic. The Americans watched, not like guards, like witnesses. SGT. Markovitz leaned against the mess hall one morning, chewing gum, arms crossed. He watched Marta drag a weighted dummy across the field and muttered, "Damn." Not with scorn. With admiration. He walked up to her later, offered a handshake. She took it. "You ever think about staying?" he asked. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "After, when they send you back, you don't have to go. There are programs, work releases, sponsor families, you could apply." Marta looked out at the field, where the women dragged ropes and flipped tires under a rising sun. "No," she said. "But thank you." Markovitz didn't ask why. He just nodded. They both knew the answer. Strength, real strength, wasn't something you inherited. It wasn't something you wore on a uniform or stitched onto your sleeve. It was earned. And earned strength didn't need to flee. It needed to return. To rebuild. To fight in a new way. Not with rifles, but with example. By late summer, the rumor mill churned with news. A batch of POWs were being scheduled for transport, some by train, some by ship. Destination, Bremerhaven, Germany. The final leg of a long, strange journey. Marta was on the list. So were Gertrude, Helga, and G, and nearly 50 others. The news settled over the camp like dusk. Not grief, not relief, just weight. The knowledge that something unexpected and vital was about to end. and that no one had the words for what it had become. The night before their departure, the Americans did something uncharacteristic. They threw a send-off. It wasn't official. No flags, no medals, just a long table set up near the parade ground. Bread, potatoes, a bit of jam, no meat that had to be saved for the army men, but someone had brought pie, real American pie, cherry and apple. Miss Caroline baked them herself. As the women ate, the sun dipped low over the Nebraska horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played. Someone was singing low, slow, off-key, a song no one quite recognized but didn't want to interrupt. Then came a clatter. Sergeant Jensen, the woman in uniform who handled supply, stood up with a folded paper in her hands. She walked toward Marta and handed it over. Marta unfolded it slowly. It was a certificate, typed signed. In recognition of voluntary physical conditioning, POW training program, Fort Robinson. Marta blinked. At the bottom in cursive. She started with laughter. She ended with strength. Capt. Raymond J. Ellis. Marta folded the paper gently. Not out of pride. Out of respect. That night back in the cabin, she placed it inside her satchel, alongside the Red Cross soap, the comb, the empty wrapper from the first piece of chocolate she'd ever been handed by someone who didn't want anything in return. And her brother's photo. She hadn't looked at it in weeks. Now she did. And for the first time she didn't cry. She whispered instead, Du Westals Juessen. You would have been proud. The train arrived at dawn. It was not like the one that had brought them here months ago. It was cleaner. It smelled of coal and oil, but not fear. The guards didn't shout. They helped carry satchels. One American soldier, barely older than 20, gave Helga a small pack of gum and smiled sheepishly. She grunted but took it. Marta was the last to board. As she stepped up into the car, she turned. Behind the rope fence, across the training yard, the Americans stood at ease. Not waving. Just watching. And as the train began to roll forward, Marta saw it. Small, fast, impossible to miss. A salute. Not from an officer. From one of the enlisted men, the same boy who'd helped build the second training yard. He stood with his back straight, eyes forward, hand raised. She didn't return it. She didn't have to. The movement of the train did it for her. 1 inch at a time. Forward. Always forward. 6 months later, in a ruined district of Munich, a woman ran through the snow. Her boots were worn but laced tight. Her breath steamed in the morning air. In one hand she carried a hammer, in the other rope. Behind her, 3 other women followed. They weren't soldiers. They weren't Americans. But they moved like people who had seen what preparation looked like. They cleared the rubble in silence. Drove stakes into frozen earth. Lashed rope between iron posts that had once held propaganda banners. When they were done, Marta stepped back and nodded. It wasn't much. A bar, a tire, a clearing. But it was enough. Enough for someone to start again. To rebuild muscle. To rebuild self. To remember. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the certificate. Unfolded it. Looked once more at the words. She started with laughter. She ended with strength. And then, without ceremony, she placed it beneath a loose stone by the tire. Not to hide it. To anchor it. A foundation. Because strength didn't come from what you brought with you. It came from what you built after everything else was gone. And in that cold, broken morning, with ash in the wind and roofs still open to sky, Marta lifted herself onto the bar and pulled. Once. Twice. 3 times. and smiled, not because it was easy, but because now she understood what the Americans had known all along. You never train for today. You train for what's coming next.